Well, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining our webinar. I hope you find the next 45 minutes, and then we're going to have some Q&A as well, so up to about an hour we'll be together here. Hope you find it to be extremely useful as we talk about leadership levers or levers. You may hear me using a bit of both here. It's a bit like tomato, how you pronounce this. Well, starting off first of all with this famous quote that with a lever long enough and a fulcrum on which to stand, I'll move the world. And so as we look at the topic of leadership, that's what we're going to be looking for today, is what are the leverage points? What are the fulcrums that we know through a lot of research now can really move the world? And we really need it. When you take a look every once in a while, just for the heck of it, I'll go into Amazon, which I just did in preparation for this session, to see how many leadership books are now available. There you see, there's about 240,000 books on leadership available at Amazon. So there's lots of stuff on leadership. And what in the world do we do with all of that? How do we really determine where are those leverage points? So that's what we're going to be talking about here today, is we're going to take a look at the research that went into building this new workshop. And it's going to be a bit of a play within the play over the next hour. I'm going to be drawing out and taking you through some of the workshop pieces and approaches and agendas and so on. And in that, help you get perhaps more up to speed on what we are learning about where the leverage points are to really accelerate leadership and build those critical strengths. So we'll talk about that. We'll look at the levers then that have come out. What are they? The 6 main areas. And then we'll look at how do we leverage strengths. We'll talk a little bit about the power of strength building, and which is really looking back over the last 15 or 20 years of work from across various fields and disciplines, but certainly from Zenger-Folkman and our work with them. We'll talk about, and then as we're looking for our own leverage points, what is our leadership sweet spot? We all have a very personal, individual sweet spot, and we'll talk a little bit about the formula that we've uncovered and developed to find that sweet spot, and then how we leverage that sweet spot through cross-training, which is another evidence-based approach that lays out a map or a method for each of the strengths and helps each individual really map out for themselves how to get there. We'll finish up with a few next steps and options, and then we'll leave about 10 minutes or so for questions and answers. And in fact, you'll see in your panel that there is a place for you to look for or to ask questions. And I'll just bring up the screenshot of that. So if you want to ask a question, type it in, as you see shown there on the slide. And we'll, at the end of this session, I'll take a skim, take a look through those questions and pull out the ones that seem to be the broadest or most relevant for everyone here. So that's a quick look at where we're going to be heading over the next while. I'll say a bit as well about our partnership with Zenger-Folkman. Jack Zenger and I go back to our previous consulting companies. His was called Zenger-Miller throughout the 80s and 90s, early 90s. Ours was the Achieve Group, and we were a strategic partner with Zenger-Miller at the time. They all became part of a much larger company, which was eventually Achieve Global and has now changed hands again and continues its evolution. Jack and I went our separate ways about 20-some years ago and reconnected about 4 years ago when he was looking for a strategic partner in Canada. And so we reconnected based on all the things that I've known about working with Jack and just what a powerful team he's put together. And particularly as you're going to see over the next while, the deep research-based approach. Because again, we're back to all of these theories on leadership, 240,000 books on leadership, all this stuff on leadership. What Zenger-Folkman has done so well, as you'll see, is really cut through that and come up with what are the critical elements. So we'll take a look at what those are. And so as I said, I'll be drawing from a new workshop that was just developed this year that has a number of components to it. You see on the screen here, participant manuals and materials and reference guides and so on. And we'll kind of skip through and draw a bit of the learning from those. And so hopefully you'll take away much more from this webinar today than you're paying for it today. And as well, if you're interested in looking deeper at the workshop itself, then we'll be sending you a follow-up and giving you a little more information, and you can inquire and follow through with us for a little more detail. So the workshop agenda itself is going to be fairly similar to what we're going to be covering here in this webinar. We're going to talk, first of all, about some of the research on leadership and leadership development. We're going to use the CPO model, which is a central framework for finding the leadership sweet spot. You'll see what CPO stands for. We'll look at those 6 leadership levers, just briefly have an overview of them, and then take a look at what are some steps that you can use to identify where you'll find your greatest leverage, what it is that you really want to work on. And that will then take us into looking at cross-training through as a way of leveraging strengths. So the goal of the workshop, and what I hope today you walk away with some further thoughts on, or perhaps enhancement for yourself, is to create a development plan that builds higher levels of competence or skill in one of the leadership levers. And so that's a main focal point, as you'll see, that we'll be continually coming back to work on building that plan. And here's one of the first exercises that we do in the session, and it's drawing on some of our research around how many people actually have a leadership development plan, have actually put something to paper. Now, formal might not mean it's super formal or detailed, but at least have sat down and said, okay, here's what I'm working on, here's some of the steps I'm taking, and just formalized in even a semi-formal way a plan. So what we'll often ask is for participants to identify, are they currently working on one? Did they do some of this maybe 6 months ago, or perhaps a year ago, or it's been over 2 years, or maybe even never? Our research shows that, sadly, only about 10% of leaders have a development plan. But those that do find, we find again, have tremendous higher levels of effectiveness and growth. Because what happens when we have a leadership plan is it escalates quite dramatically the likelihood of our development, our growth and development. There is, however, a natural inclination, and we're going to talk about some of this trap. The trap of many development plans or performance improvement plans is to focus on weaknesses, and that tends to peter out more quickly than building strengths. Oftentimes, the real question here in any leadership development effort, whether it's in a training program or it's a performance management process, is, well, what do I work on? How do I figure out what to work on? So we're going to certainly address that. Too often what happens is there's a list of competencies. Many organizations have competency models, and if not throwing darts, maybe exactly, that's probably exaggerating a little bit, but it certainly is the second point there, that there's a tendency to focus in on weaknesses as the way of determining what to work on. What we're going to see, and this is where the CPO model will come in and help, is how we're going to link the plan to the organization's needs and the leader's passion or energy to produce much better results. So here's a quick look at the sort of steps we put into this plan. And the CPO model, competence, passion, organizational need, is what we see right off the top, and then the plan builds around that. So you'll see how that unfolds. So to begin, of course, there are so many different theories and ideas on leadership, as we just looked at, and we need to, for the purposes of our work here, come up with a definition. So in the interests of trying to simplify and, again, look for the leverage points, here's the simple definition that we use throughout all of this work and this process. It's that behavior that elevates individual performance and drives superior organizational outcomes. So it's the two together that leadership needs to focus on what matters to the organization, and as we'll see, what the leader is also passionate about. So here's a little bit of background on what you're about to see and the research we're going to look at and how it's evolved. Zenger-Folkman have published 2 books that deal with building strengths. The first one was The Extraordinary Leader, and the foundation program and the foundation research that we're going to be drawing from here today all comes out of that original work, which started around 2000 and 2002 in that time period. So looking back a number of years now. And it then was expanded on in an updated version of the book around 2007. And then a few years ago, How to Be Exceptional, expanded and updated that even further and summarized and condensed it even a little bit more. So this started with identifying 16 competencies that most clearly differentiated poor leaders, good leaders, and extraordinary leaders. Of course, there are dozens and dozens of competency models around. Zenger-Folkman actually has almost 100 competencies identified in their main database, but lots of them don't matter that much. Which are the ones that really matter? That became the key question. And so over the last 16, 15 years or so, this has been repeatedly validated as a predictor of good or bad outcomes. When these competencies are done well, we have positive outcomes in almost every case, with very, very little exception. When these competencies are done very poorly, we have negative outcomes, again, with very little exception. So the database, that this is now drawing from is almost 1,000,000 360 assessments that rate or describe the competencies of somewhere around 75,000 leaders. And here's an example of the outcome correlations, of which there are many different kinds of outcomes. In this case, we're looking at employee satisfaction and commitment, could be looking at customer satisfaction, could be looking at a great number of other things. But this is basically saying that where we have low levels of ratings, low ratings of leadership effectiveness amongst all of the 360 raters. So this would be on average about 12, sometimes 15. Others go even higher than that, but usually around 12 raters, direct reports, peers, others that might be in or outside the organization, the leader of that, the manager of that person. So when you look at all of their ratings combined, that's the bottom part of the axis here. When everybody says this is a poor leader, then the direct reports report very low levels of overall commitment. Where everyone sees the leader as being, okay, good, a good leader, then we see a higher level of overall commitment. We would say a mediocre level of commitment. And where the leaders are extraordinary, and by extraordinary we mean in the top 10%, the 90th percentile, there we see outstanding levels of commitment, or of customer service, or of quality, or of safety, and there's a long list of these kinds of outcomes that we've been able to track. So some underlying assumptions then to originally the extraordinary leader and now to our work today on leadership levers is that where there are higher skill levels, you have much higher levels of these outcomes. And we also know with a lot of research that leaders can improve, that leadership is not a fixed static thing. Leadership effectiveness can be increased, and that leadership, and the way we're going to be talking about leaders here, is fairly broad. That leader doesn't necessarily mean someone in a leadership role, a supervisor, a manager, someone like that. Leader is anyone who's in a role where they're needing to influence, connect, communicate, work with others effectively, and take the initiative, take the lead in doing that. Well, of course, we need leaderful organizations to do that. Now, one of the drivers of this approach as well, leadership levers, is that we run into some organizations that have had a lot of negative experience with 360 tools. And as a result, I know of at least half a dozen organizations where the CEO has outright banned the use of 360s because they've been such a negative experience and have poisoned, in many cases, many people in the organization and created more problems than they've solved. So there are a number of leaders that are uneasy about some of that kind of feedback. A lot of it, we know again from our research, is because the focus tends to be on deficiencies, on gaps, on problems, on fixing weaknesses, which tends to be quite demoralizing for many and tends to be less effective overall. People don't stay with their plans, etc. And so we see numerous organizations that are locked into this traditional approach. We know of no other approach, actually, the 360s. I think there may be one or two emerging, but very few that are truly strength-based 360s. So as well, we have other organizations who are saying, well, we do see the power of a 360. We'd like to use a 360 perhaps in the future, but we want it to be a lot more positive experience. So this approach was put together to help lay the foundation for some of that as well. So that's a bit of the background of where we've come from. And to summarize that a little bit, if you then look at what are the leadership models that are really, in many cases, they're competencies and other things that are may or may not be capturing what really matters, what really impacts outcomes. There's dozens that don't. The competencies that really have no impact whatsoever, like organizational skills, being on time for meetings, charisma, managerial courage, entrepreneurial spirit. There's a long list of competencies like that that have zero correlation, zero predictability to outcomes. But they're really more values that somebody's putting forward and saying, this is what we believe in. And that's legitimate, but that's not a way of measuring leadership effectiveness. On the other side, we want to make sure then that they are viable. And so what are the fundamental attributes that are at the core of even boiling down the 16 competencies to something even simpler than that, and that have the greatest impact? So what does the data tell us then? Well, from those assessments of almost 800,000 assessments, we did a force field, or Zenger-Folkman did a force field analysis to identify some of the broader factors and came up then with 6 factors that really were the leverage points, and that this was quite consistent as well with lots of other research on what are the core leadership leverage points. So let's take a look at what they are. The 6 leadership levers. Here's where we need a little drum roll. Ta-da! Here we go. What are they? Well, one is business and technical acumen. So really understanding the core business of the organization, its core technologies, whether that's clinical in a healthcare kind of organization, engineering in a technical organization, customer service or deeper levels of what drives customers in a service-oriented organization. So having strong business technical acumen, focusing on results, making things happen, because ultimately, of course, that's what all of this is about. The ability to inspire and to motivate or to create inspiring kinds of environments that move away from trying to push, deliver results by pushing towards pulling and drawing out the best from others. Interpersonal skills, in fact, you could argue these two, and even our last one that we'll get to as well, are very much what emotional intelligence, the so-called softer skills of emotional intelligence that have come out to, have proven to be so critical. Having some strategy or vision, which might be across the whole organization for a senior person, or it might be at a team or departmental level for someone who's not at such a senior place. But it's being clear about what are the goals, what are the priorities, making some of those tough choices, and using those kinds of stretch goals to move everyone forward. And lastly, innovation. In today's world, particularly innovative, creative, new ways of building agile teams, agile organizations, etc., becomes absolutely critical. All right, so since we're so much about research and we believe so much in evidence-based approaches, how accurately then do these levers predict leadership effectiveness? Well, let's take a look at that research. So when we look at the 6 levers, which are the blue bars, and we compare those to the 16 that we just looked at, the aggregated scores of the 16 competencies that we looked at a few minutes ago, we see extremely strong correlations. Let's break that down even further then to look at the impact of these each of these levers on overall effectiveness. So again, drawing from that large database where we saw no profound strength. So what you're about to see is anyone who's seen as being in the top 10% on any of those 6 levers, where there's none of that happening, then they're at the 39th percentile. Now that also means they don't have any big problems amongst those 6, any big weaknesses. We're going to come to that in a few minutes. It's a term we call fatal flaw. So there's no flaw there, but there's also no profound strength. So this is kind of middle of the road. So someone who's doing okay, middle of the road in the overall database, they're just barely above the bottom third of the database. When we look at taking any one of the 6 levers to the 70 or to the 90th percentile, so getting good at just one, talk about leverage, that takes that leader to the 70, almost to the top quartile. If we have 2, it is well into the top quartile. 3 levers at the 90th percentile gets us into the top 10%, which is extraordinary leader territory, and so on. So we see tremendous impact that comes from just a couple of levers, and the more that we can add, the higher that impact becomes. We have a little acronym here that we use for the 6 levers. That is I-RAISE, for just a slightly different order of putting them in, and as a way to remember what some of them are. So a bit of a recap then. What we're trying to do, part of what we're trying to do with this approach and this process is to avoid some of this competency model trap. I'm hearing increasingly, I was at a conference last week actually, where there was a panel presentation, and one of the panelists said the word competency is becoming quite a dirty word in our organization. It's something that people are really having difficulty with. And I don't think that's terribly widespread, but there is a lot more concern about the problems of competency models. And so what we've tried to do is to go beyond competencies to broader capabilities that get into more of the core using a terminology such as levers or levers, and that we know people should have at least a minimal capability. We're going to take a look at that momentarily. And that each of us has a natural home or a natural attraction to one or two of these levers more than to the others. And so how can we build off of that to find our leverage point and to really use that as our fulcrum to move us forward. And so that takes us to some of the really good news out of all of this is you don't have to be a superhero to be an extraordinary leader. You don't have to be good at everything. There's actually, in this next little bit of work we're going to look at, there's a bit of research. This goes way back now, over 100 years ago. Edward Thorndike talked about the halo effect, or what's now coming to be known as confirmation bias, where he identified that there's a tendency to think of a person in general as either good or bad, and that colors the judgment of all of their qualities. You think about when you first meet somebody, if you really take a liking to them and instantly just really connect with them, you're going to look for a lot of the things that reinforce those positive feelings and say, hey, well, there's something else. Oh, wow, she's good at that too. Oh, he can really do that as well. Whereas the opposite will often happen. We meet somebody that turns us off immediately. First thing we're going to start doing is, oh, look at that. Can you believe what he just, oh, wow, look at that. And we start looking for all the negative qualities. So there's this halo or horns effect, depending on which side it is. Here's a little test for yourself. Test this out for yourself to see just how true this tendency is. Think about one of the best leaders you've ever known. And what was it? What are a couple of their qualities that made them so outstanding? I bet you can fairly quickly go back to one of those levers and identify a couple that really stood out for that person. Now, did he or she have any weaknesses? Now, of course. They're human beings. Some of them weren't good at particular things. Maybe even people kind of joked about it or realized that, yeah, they aren't always on time for meetings, or yeah, they're not always the most organized, or yeah, every once in a while they'll be a little volatile and go off and be a little emotional. And so there's some of these sorts of things that will say, yeah, they're certainly not perfect human beings. You think about some of the famous world leaders we know, Kennedy, Gandhi, Churchill, you go down the list, Steve Jobs, you go down the list of leaders that are considered to be real high impact leaders. They weren't perfect human beings. So they weren't average or above average on everything, but they had a couple of profound strengths that really stood out. And that we have found is the only way to become an exceptional leader. I remember reading Peter Drucker's book of his years ago when I first moved into management, many, many years ago for me. And he said, we need to staff for strength, not the absence of weaknesses. And that's something that has really stuck with me over the years. We need to, that outstanding leaders aren't just having fewer weaknesses, they have tremendous strengths. And those strengths overshadow any weaker areas that they have. So here's in the objective world, maybe in the world of Star Trek with Spock or Data, whatever your favorite Star Trek series is, would look at each person objectively and measure everything out in a sort of mathematical formula. Well, that's not how the real world works. How the real world works is a couple of things stand out. And those traits either magnify everything else, pull everything else up with it, or diminish everything else and pull everything down. And in fact, on that note, we'll take a look at what happens when there is a fatal flaw, when something is so weak that it is causing a major distraction for that individual that you can't see their strengths. Here's where they end up. In our database, they're in the bottom 15% of the database, bottom 10th percentile in many cases. I've even seen some that are the first and second percentile, and just really pulled down by some very serious fatal flaw. So the insight here is that leaders can't be incompetent at any of the leadership levels, like incompetent meaning a fatal flaw, but can be weaker at some of them. Okay, so how do we leverage the strengths then? How do we build on this idea? Well, quick bit of background from what we know, that leveraging strengths is the key to higher leadership. Here's many, many organizations like Yale have been using the extraordinary leader for years now, and this is one comment of their experiences of how it helps to leverage us to higher levels. But what does performance improvement mean most of the time? In a performance appraisal discussion, spending an hour in a performance appraisal discussion, how much time do we spend on strengths? How much time do we spend on the improvement plan? What's the improvement plan? Fixing weaknesses, closing gaps. Well, here's an area you need to get better at. Here's what you need to improve. And so fixing weaknesses has become equated with focusing on, or as part of our improvement. And what we want to do, and hopefully part of what you'll come away with here, is a sense that this is not an effective way to be building leadership strengths. So we want to mind the gap. When you think about it, working on weaknesses at best gets you to average. It doesn't produce exceptional leaders. It's not the absence of weaknesses, but it's the presence of strengths that leads us to exceptional leadership. So that means that we really have three choices when we're trying to figure out how to get better, or we're trying to help our leaders get better. We can help them try to eliminate weaknesses. If it's a fatal flaw, we're going to have to do that. We can work with them to try to look at all 6 levers, or in many competency models, there's 8, 10, 12, 15 competencies, to say, okay, let's figure out how to get better across the board, which of course is highly unlikely, or we can work on strengths. The first two don't make leaders exceptional, that it is by working on strengths that we move to high levels of effectiveness. Here's in fact some research to support that. This is taken from a number of organizations where they've done multiple 360s and have tracked people who've worked on fixing weaknesses versus those working on strengths. And so what's found is, the good news is that if somebody does put a plan together and at least works on something, fixing weaknesses has an impact. And so we know that from thousands, tens of thousands of data points now, tracking many of these individuals. But here's what happens when people work on building strengths. The impact, as seen by everybody else, this is data that comes from 360s, noticed by everybody else, that a strength focus doubles how everybody else rates the improvement levels of that leader. Why does that happen? Well, there's lots of different reasons. Let's take a look at a couple of them. Think about examples of behaviors or activities that you don't enjoy doing. Maybe you go back to the 6 levers and say, well, there's a couple things on there. Yeah, I'll do them because I know they're needed, but I don't really like doing it that much. Do you really look forward to working on those to get better? Not likely. Now think of maybe a couple of the levers that you really enjoy. How do you feel about working on those? Well, for most people, it's a lot more energizing, and it's a lot more likely that they're going to stick with development. Why is that? Because a big part of it has to do with passion. That when we work on a strength, it's likely something we enjoy and are passionate about. Those two tend to go together. And so working on something that you're passionate about has a much higher probability of follow-through and noticeable improvement. In fact, we have, again, research to prove that. We've surveyed leaders on both sides who've worked on strengths and weaknesses, and what we found is leaders who work on strengths put much more time and effort into their plan. Their overall leadership effectiveness is higher. We just saw some of that research. They improve specific issues in their development plan. They put more time into the plan and a lot more effort into the plan. So we're going to now take a look at, so how do we decide what to work on, and how does passion play a role in all of this? How do we bring together passion and competence? So here's a couple of things to consider. This is drawn out of the workshop again. Passion is what energizes us, and passion generally correlates to competence. We tend to be better at things that we enjoy most. That's common sense, and again, research shows that to be the case. But passion and competence don't always go together. Some people around us might hold a slightly different view of our singing ability in the shower, for example. So, how should a leader select what to work on? Well, what is the greatest need? Their own need or the organizational need might be part of that consideration. Where is the highest payoff? Maybe another part of that. And what will be sustained becomes critical. So that takes us to the CPO model. The C being competence or skill, the O being organization's need, and the P is our passion or energy. There's the leadership sweet spot. Where we can bring those three together is where we're going to find a dramatically higher likelihood of outcome, and that's a leverage point. This is a fulcrum. This is a key point that can help move us forward. So assessments can help the leader understand competence using something like a 360, and we can often get a sense of organizational needs. Certainly our own assessment tool, the Extraordinary Leader tool, does ask questions for what are the competencies most important to this leader. So we can get a sense of that. What we tend not to get from an assessment is what is the passion that the individual has of what to work on. So I'm going to flip you over now into, well, how do we help to get at that in the workshop? And this might be something you want to think about to take away from this webinar for yourself. So think about a time when you really achieved something extraordinary. It might have been in the last year or two, might be going back quite a few years. But it's a time when time flew by, you were engaged, you were excited, you really were caught up in what you were doing. So what we would have you do then is to use the CPO model, so this is a slide right out of the workshop, to list what the factors were, and then have a group discussion around, so what were some of the common experiences, the factors that made it extraordinary, and sharing that around with the rest of the group. And that then allows us to begin to take a look at, so what are the ways that we can assess our own passion, but also where some of the organizational needs might be, and as well as how we're seen in some of those areas, what our strengths are. So the preferences often correlate with competency, and in the Leadership Levers program, there's 13 items that participants do, 13-item quiz that they do online ahead of the workshop that allows them to get a handle on what is needed or what their leverage points are, what their preferences are, and so there's no 360 here. So here's some other suggestions that we make is ways to get feedback on my effectiveness, because there isn't a 360 here, is that I might talk to my boss or manager, I might talk to my team or peers, I might take a 360 assessment or perhaps have done one in the past and can draw from that. And we certainly continue to encourage people to find ways to get that feedback that takes them beyond just their own self-assessment or self-perception of their competency or their effectiveness in the 6 levers. When they've done the online assessment, here's what comes back. It's handed out at the workshop. Each person gets their report. And this then leads us into using the CPO grid to find the leverage points. So starting first of all, here's an example. This person has said, well, here are my 3 preferences, so or the 3 areas that I think I'm strongest at. And then through some of the other exercises, there's a few others that I've skipped over here for interest of time, but we identify then what my passion points are, and often the 2 are fairly close to each other, but not always. We see in this example those not exactly mirroring each other. And so then we start to figure out, now what's the third part of this, organizational need? Because we don't have 360 data, we're going to have to dig down a little deeper. So one of the exercises we use here is to have people pair up with each other, exchange their manuals, and the one interviews the other, and go through a series of questions to identify where they see the greatest organizational need. And we'll see some of those questions momentarily. The interviewer then records the responses and gives the manual back to the participant. So now it's helping participants starting to think through what are the needs of the organization for my role. So here's roughly the sorts of questions that are being asked. What would make the most difference in your job right now? Then there's a series of questions that relate to each of the 6 levers. What would your boss say is most important? Again, relating to each of the levers. And then which is more concerning to you right now in your job? And once again, we connect those to each of the different levers. So this then allows us to do a little bit of assessment, looking and adding up and identifying where we're at amongst these 6 different levers. And we then get into coming back to our chart and to identifying and lining up and adding up what we have here. Now, it might look at, say, well, we've got a 3 in organizational need. That's perhaps where we should be looking at. But when we may want to go back and we want to ask our boss to get a little more input. We may want to look at job descriptions and performance goals, looking at the vision, the values, etc., competitive advantage, and those sorts of things. So this may be some ways we get other input for organizational need. But once we've gotten that input, and then the workshop, we obviously aren't getting that input right there. We're taking everybody's own assessment at the time. So what we highly recommend is that you look for the alignment of all 3. And that when you do that, you're going to avoid the hobby zone, which might be where we're good at it, we enjoy it, but the organization doesn't really need it. So we call that a hobby. There's another dangerous zone here where, well, sorry, this isn't so much a dangerous zone, but it's a zone that takes a little more work, which we might choose because it's a 3. But it is, we call it the novice zone. It might require a little more effort because it's not really, at the moment, seen as a strength. We want to be careful of the chore zone. This is where I'm good at it, the organization needs it, but it's work. It's drudgery. It's I owe, it's off to work I go. It's not something that I'm really all that excited about. Chances of staying with that are not very high. So how do you decide which lever, which would be the best development opportunity? Well, here's what we know, kind of a recap, that we saw how they can have a profound impact, the levers, on outcomes, that we can't really have any that are weak or seriously missing, which is what we call a fatal flaw, and that when we're at the 90th percentile with any of them, we dramatically elevate overall perceived effectiveness because of that confirmation bias or halo effect principle that's been around for 100 years or more. When we're focusing on something that we are passionate about, the chances that we're going to improve and show noticeable improvement is much higher, and that it will elevate our overall performance and our overall effectiveness. So, given all of that input, where does that leave us in terms of what to work on? Identifying one of the levers as a key leverage point. Once we've done that, then we want to start thinking about using cross-training to help us leverage that particular point. So let's talk for a few minutes about cross-training, and then we'll start to wrap things up here and move to the question and answer section. So cross-training, we think about cross-training in the world of athletics. It's been around for many years, that when somebody is training to go to a much higher level of effectiveness, let's take the example of a long-distance runner, they are not just going to go out and run more. You don't just tell them, work harder, bear down more, train longer. That actually can lead to injury and will get them to a point where they just won't move to that really high elite level. Let's say the goal is to get to the Olympics. So instead, what we see is a list of these sorts of cross-training activities that the athlete might choose a few of these or even rotate around a couple of them to really strengthen their effectiveness in the overall sport. Well, let's take an example. Take the example of inspiration from one of the levers. Each one of them has had research done to identify people who are already at the 90th percentile. So we went, searched through the database, found everybody for each one of the levers that was already there, and then identified what else, what do they all share in common that tells us there's a leverage effect going on here. So some of them are pretty obvious, like with inspiration, strong communication skills tends to show up quite a bit. That's what you'd kind of expect. Others sometimes aren't quite so obvious, like establishing stretch goals. That might be a little bit more surprising. And so there's a number of others to choose from as well. And what we provide then as part of the participant manual is this competency behavior development guide, which has from 7 to 12 behaviors that correlate to each of the levers, providing a new approach for leveraging that strength and helping to map that out as part of the, which is part of the participant manual. So here's an example with innovation. We start to take a look at risk-taking or supporting others or solving problems or championing change, strategic perspective. Begin to see a number of leverage points. So the individual can take a look at that and identify a couple that perhaps correlate back to their passion, back to the need, back to some of the earlier work that's been done. And then each one of those bubbles around the outside has a page like this that digs down deeper into that one. So if I've chosen, well, as part of innovation, I want to take more risks and challenge the status quo, well, here's a couple of things, a couple of ideas of how I might do that. All of this meant, of course, to be grist for the mill, to be ideas, part of brainstorming, to identify potential action plans that I can put into my development plan. So my development plan then allows me to look for where those leverage points are, find the companion behaviors, and begin to build around those companion behaviors, building my action plan. So we've covered a fair bit of territory here in a pretty short period of time. Let's now step back, take a look at what are some of the potential next steps. In the workshop, here's what we suggest for the kind of work we've just walked through. which is to meet with your manager to talk further about your development plan, to share your development goals with peers, direct reports, others. The basic principle that we find is the more people you involve in your development, the much higher is the likelihood of success. You want to revisit your plan periodically, put it in your day timer, set aside time. Again, these are the habits that we see of the most effective leaders, especially the leaders that have developed themselves from good leaders to great leaders. And we strongly do suggest using a 360 assessment. Now, our bias, our research leans us towards a strength-based 360 assessment, but getting some of that feedback can be very, very valuable and useful. So, feedback, just on that note of feedback, again, strongly suggesting find ways to get feedback, to gather that as part of an ongoing effort for your development. Looking for ways, even simple ideas like, well, what should we keep doing, stop doing, start doing? Some of those kinds of simple exercises can be a way of gathering more feedback from people around you. And again, a 360 can be very, very useful to doing that. Many of you, I think, already know a little bit about the Extraordinary Leader. It is our website. There's lots more information. It is the Foundation 360 program that I showed you earlier. A lot of the research has been drawn from for this leadership levers approach. And so we offer this in a variety of ways, one-on-one coaching of different sorts, a workshop, so typically a one-day workshop. There is some online offerings now coming on as well. So if you go to the Zenger-Folkman Programs and Services section of our website, you can find more as well in our follow-up email. We'll be sending you more information. So as a way of summarizing then, coming back to, so what have we learned? Where are we at with leadership levers? Well, what are some of the key learning outcomes from this process and development of this approach and the research I showed you? Well, connecting the organization with leadership strengths and passion is key. We want to leverage strengths as we know being the fastest and the best way to increase overall leadership effectiveness. We have a white paper which we'll tell you a little more about in our follow-up as well that is around some of the research behind that. Creating a development plan is very key to helping leaders improve and go from good to great. And that development plan, when it draws from cross-training approaches, again, we see that can have quite an impact. So as we wrap things up, we will be sending you shortly a survey following this webinar, and we'll be drawing from the survey for one of my more recent books. You see, we'll draw for one of each of those books that you see on your screen. So watch for that survey, and we'll be drawing and letting you know who the winners of the survey are. There are also some upcoming webinars you might be interested in knowing more about as well. There's one on October 25th that steps back a bit more broadly and looks at what are some of the essential building blocks in three main areas, which are the three main areas of focus for us to do with leadership development, culture development, and coaching. So some of this will talk a bit more about the Zenger-Folkman approaches. Some of it will talk more about the other kinds of customized, tailored work that we do that draw from my books or from some of our work in the area of culture and safety and leadership development. There's also the end of November, November 29th, a webinar specifically zeroing in on the strength-based approaches and coaching approaches that some of you've seen somewhat here. We'll get deeper into all of that. And it really, these approaches we're going to see in this webinar is what's behind the Extraordinary Leader and the Extraordinary Coach workshops, which are typically delivered in-house, internally, but occasionally, as is coming up in January in Toronto, we do have public workshops. So you can go to our coming events section of our website to get more information on that right now if you're interested, or again, we'll send you a bit more information when we follow up with our email and survey. All right, well, we've covered a lot of territory here in a pretty short period of time. A bit of the drink from the proverbial fire hose. So invited you earlier to send in some questions, um, and so I'm looking now at a couple of questions that have come in. One is it possible to identify the 6 levers without going through a 360 evaluation? Well, the 6 levers have been identified already. I assume, reading behind that a little bit more, it's trying to come up with which one of the levers are going to be most important for me. Because the research that I just showed you is saying we've already done that work. We've already, drawing from this big 360 database, we've identified what the levers are. And one thing you might want to do, and maybe what's behind this question as well, is if you look at your own competency model to say, well, where do those levers line up with our competencies? You'll probably see lots of places that they do, and perhaps places where they may not be there, like business acumen or technical skills sometimes is in competency model, sometimes not. Strategic perspective is sometimes there, sometimes not. So you may want to just kind of take a look at some of that and see how all of that lines up. Someone else has asked, are the booklets and materials, are we going to send out the PowerPoint? The PowerPoint, we will be archiving this presentation on our website, so you'll be able to access everything again that I've sent you or just walk through. You'll find this link in the follow-up email, and you can skip back through the PowerPoint. A little trick that I'll tell you, you may already know, if you go to the bottom scroll bar on the webinar, you can put your cursor on the scroll bar and just follow along the scroll bar with your cursor, and each of the slides pops up. You can click there and go right to that slide and to the audio that's gone with that slide if you want to skip around a little bit. Someone else is saying it was a valuable session. Appreciate that. Thanking, got a couple thank you notes here. How does the work differ from Clifton's Strength Finder, strength-based leadership, etc.? Well, this is the 360 approach of the extraordinary leader is very different because it's a 360. In this case, the kinds of strengths that we've identified are a little bit different. I think you'll find if you take a look at the Strength Finder tool, you'll certainly see some areas that are similar. You'll see some that are a little bit different. Both are self-assessments, and what I think this then differs from is the application, the workshop itself. It's not just somebody sitting down and doing this on their own, but it's going through the workshop. I went through it this summer, and as a master trainer of master facilitator of the extraordinary leader, was certified as well to deliver this, and I was very impressed with the kinds of exercises, the sort of leading edge design of the session to really accelerate the day, how quickly someone can go through and find their leverage point and then use cross-training. There's where I would think one of the huge differences is between this and, say, Strength Finder or other tools, is that this provides cross-connections to help you find those leverage points. Yeah, this folks, somebody else just actually made that comment that they think one of the big differences is that it, between this and Strength Finder, is that it focuses on profound strengths, which it certainly does. A couple of other questions are asking, my own company has their own 360 process. Would the leadership levers workshop be compatible? Absolutely, and that's what it was. Part of the reason why it was designed was to step one level above specific competency models and to say, well, whatever competency model you're using, these are the underlying or core leadership behaviors or traits or approaches that cut across those models and help individuals, instead of trying to fix a whole bunch of things or instead of trying to focus in on their weaknesses, to say, okay, what can I leverage here? What am I going to stick with? Because our opinion is that ultimately it's about what leadership development plan someone's going to stick with that's going to make the big difference. Just taking a look through a couple of others. What leader management level is most appropriate this is most appropriate for? Well, as we talked at the beginning, leadership we're defining pretty broadly as an action, not a position. Leadership is what you do, not the role that you're in. And so we've seen already that this is being used sometimes with mixed groups where you've got those in formal leadership roles, those who are not in formal leadership roles. Oftentimes at the very senior levels, 360s and one-on-one coaching is used. And so it probably will be more for mid to more supervisory level and frontline level, or high value individual contributor, professional level. That's most likely the level that we're going to see this used at most often. How can I get more information about the public workshops, one-on-one coaching, etc.? Some of that will be in the follow-up email, and we'll have links there. Certainly, we have a large website with lots of information. You'll find a whole Zenger-Folkman section, and you'll find a coming events section, which has some of the materials and things in it that I've talked about here as well. Okay, is there a book that the content from this webinar is pulled from? The books I mentioned, The Extraordinary Leader, The Extraordinary Coach, are primarily where the base research for this is. The actual levers themselves, there's a white paper that we'll be including a link to in our follow-up for you, which does give you the specifics to this approach that draws from some of that earlier work. Well, that looks like that's pretty much the questions, and hopefully you have found a number of ideas that you can walk away with here today. And of course, we're delighted to talk with you further about the Leadership Levers program. And I'm going to wrap up with a comment that I came across recently from Tim Ferriss, who's written a number of books and is an investor and public speaker. And he's talking here about leveraging strengths. He talks about how it's a lot more lucrative, instead of fix all the chinks in your armor or the weaker areas. And then he goes on to say that it's a choice between multiplying of results using our strengths or incrementally trying to make those little improvements and fix the weaknesses, which, as he says, and we certainly know, is going to do no better than get you maybe to average. It's certainly not going to leverage a leader to very highest levels of effectiveness. So thanks for joining us. Hopefully you have taken away a few good thoughts, ideas. We look forward to connecting with you, and all the best as you go out there and you look for your leadership leverage point and your fulcrum to move the world. Thanks again.